On May 7th, 2026, at approximately 2:45 in the morning local time, Ukraine launched the most consequential long-range strike package of the entire war. Over 200 drones and an undisclosed number of Palianitsia cruise missiles crossed into Russian territory simultaneously, targeting 3 separate locations at once: the Saratov oil refinery, 600 kilometers from the Ukrainian border; the Engels 2 strategic bomber air base in the Saratov region, home to Russia's nuclear-capable Tu-95MS Bear H and Tu-160 Blackjack bombers; and a critical rail logistics hub near Voronezh that Russia had been using to push ammunition, fuel, and armored vehicles toward the Zaporizhzhia front. By dawn, satellite imagery confirmed fires at all 3 locations. Russian air defense intercepted the majority of incoming drones, but 11 confirmed impacts were recorded at Engels 2 alone, damaging 2 aircraft hangars and a fuel storage depot. No nuclear assets were reported hit, according to Russian state media. But here's the thing. That is not the point. The point is that Ukraine reached Engels 2 again, and this time, Russia did not stay silent. Within 48 hours of the strikes, President Vladimir Putin appeared on Russian state television. He spoke for less than 4 minutes, but those 4 minutes sent a signal through every NATO headquarters, every European foreign ministry, and every American intelligence facility that has been processing the implications ever since. Putin stated directly that Russia considers the provision of weapons to Ukraine that are used to strike Russian territory as an act of co-belligerence. He said NATO member states supplying these weapons are no longer acting as neutral parties. And then came the sentence that stopped rooms full of diplomats mid-conversation. Russia reserves the right to respond asymmetrically to attacks on its strategic infrastructure, including through means that go beyond the geographic boundaries of the current conflict. He did not say the word nuclear. He did not need to. The combination of the words strategic infrastructure, the specific reference to Engels 2, which houses nuclear delivery platforms, and the explicit phrase beyond the geographic boundaries of the current conflict was understood by everyone in the room and everyone watching. Russia was saying, without saying it directly, you helped Ukraine hit our nuclear bomber base, and we are now considering options that do not stop at Ukraine's borders. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte convened an emergency call with alliance defense ministers within 24 hours of Putin's statement. The communiqué that followed was carefully worded, but its meaning was clear. Europe was on edge again, not in the vague background 3 years of this war way. In the specific, concrete, decisions are being made right now way that comes just before genuinely dangerous things happen. Now here is what makes Engels 2 different from every other target Ukraine has struck inside Russia, and why this particular strike produced this particular response. Most people who follow this war understand that Russia has been launching devastating cruise missile and drone barrages against Ukrainian cities, power stations, water systems, and heating infrastructure throughout the conflict. What fewer people understand is exactly where those strikes originate. The Tu-95MS Bear H and the Tu-160 Blackjack bombers stationed at Engels 2 are Russia's primary strategic aviation platforms for this war. These aircraft carry the Kh-101 cruise missile, which exists in both a conventional variant and a nuclear-tipped variant. Every major wave of Russian strikes that plunged Ukrainian cities into darkness over the past 2 winters, every attack on hospitals and maternity wards that drew international condemnation, every barrage that forced Ukrainian engineers to work through the night to restore power to millions of civilians, was enabled in significant part by bombers that took off from Engels 2. By striking that airbase, Ukraine was not simply hitting a military installation that happened to be inside Russia. It was striking the launch platform itself. It was demonstrating that the aircraft used to terrorize Ukrainian civilians can be reached, damaged, and potentially destroyed on the ground before they ever get airborne. From Kiev's perspective, the operational logic is clear. If Russia's bomber fleet at Engels 2 is at risk, Russia must either reduce the tempo of strategic aviation strikes on Ukraine or accept that its most valuable long-range attack platforms are sitting targets. But from Moscow's perspective, the calculation runs in an entirely different direction. Ukraine, equipped with weapons designed, manufactured, and supplied by United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, struck a nuclear-capable airbase on Russian soil. That is the line Putin has been drawing since February 2022. It has now been crossed twice, with the second crossing causing significantly more damage than the first. Let's go back to December 2022, because the history here matters enormously. That was the first time Ukrainian drones struck Engels 2, and it shocked the world. 2 Tu-95 bombers were damaged. Russia's air defense, which had been presented as essentially impenetrable, had failed to stop drones that traveled hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory and struck one of the country's most sensitive military installations. Moscow responded with fury in official statements, and then, operationally, with almost nothing. No strikes on NATO supply routes, no escalation beyond Ukraine's borders. The pattern was set. Ukraine crossed a line Russia had drawn. Russia threatened serious consequences. The consequences, measured in actual military action beyond Ukraine, did not materialize. Fast forward to May 2026. Ukraine has now struck Engels 2 a second time, with greater precision, with greater effect, and using weapons that did not exist in the Ukrainian arsenal in December 2022. The Palyannitsia cruise missile is a Ukrainian-designed system that entered operational service in late 2025. Its integration with a swarm attack of over 200 drones represents a level of operational sophistication that Ukrainian forces did not possess 3 years ago. This is not the same Ukraine that launched improvised drone strikes in 2022. This is a Ukraine that has been at war for 4 years, that has received tens of billions of dollars in Western military assistance, that has trained thousands of operators and engineers, and that has developed genuine domestic defense production capacity. The strike package on May 7th reflected all of that development, and Russia's response reflected the understanding that this is not going to get easier. Here's what we know about the battlefield situation in May 2026, because the military context is inseparable from the diplomatic crisis unfolding in European capitals. Russian forces currently hold approximately 18% more Ukrainian territory than they controlled before February 2022. They hold most of Luhansk Oblast. They hold large portions of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts. They hold Crimea, which they have occupied since 2014. The front line stretches approximately 1,100 kilometers. Russian advances over the past 6 months have been grinding but real. Chasiv Yar in Donetsk Oblast fell in October 2025, after months of brutal urban combat that reduced the city to rubble. As of May 2026, Russian forces are pressing on Pokrovsk, a logistics hub whose capture would seriously complicate Ukrainian supply lines across central Donetsk. But Russia is paying an extraordinary price for these incremental advances. Western intelligence assessments from both the British Ministry of Defense and the American Defense Intelligence Agency indicate Russian casualties since February 2022 now exceed 900,000, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Monthly casualty rates have remained above 30,000 for over 12 consecutive months. Russia has been supplementing its losses with North Korean troops, approximately 12,000 of whom were deployed to Kursk Oblast beginning in late 2024, a fact now openly acknowledged by both Seoul and Washington. Russia has also been drawing down pre-war equipment reserves at a rate that multiple independent analysts project cannot be sustained beyond mid-2027, without catastrophic degradation of armored capability. This is the military picture behind Putin's warning. A Russian military that is winning territory slowly at enormous cost, with sustainability questions mounting, and a Ukrainian military that is absorbing those costs while simultaneously developing the capability to reach deeper into Russia with more precision than ever before. The May 7th strikes did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in the context of a war that both sides understand is approaching a point where the current trajectory becomes unsustainable for at least one of them. Now let's wargame the next 72 hours, because this is the window that actually matters right now. It is hour zero. Putin's warning has been delivered. NATO is in emergency session in Brussels. Ukraine has not officially confirmed the details of the May 7th strikes, consistent with standard practice, but Zelensky's office released a statement describing operations against Russian military infrastructure as legitimate acts of self-defense against a country that uses that same infrastructure to murder Ukrainian civilians. In Washington, President Trump made brief remarks to reporters at the White House on May 9th. He said Russia should not be threatening NATO. He said the United States stands fully behind its alliance commitments. He also said he hopes both sides will find a way to end what he described as a very costly and very unnecessary conflict. That combination, firmness paired with openness to negotiation, has defined Trump's approach to this war since January 2025. It reassures European allies. It also leaves enough interpretive space that Moscow cannot be entirely certain how far Washington will go if Russia actually does something beyond Ukraine's borders. Between hours 2 and 12, the operational responses begin. Poland activates elevated alert status for air defense systems along its eastern border. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania formally request additional American air patrol missions under the NATO Baltic Air Policing Framework. Germany's chancellor convenes an emergency session of the National Security Cabinet. Every European capital is asking the same question simultaneously. Is this the moment Russia actually moves beyond threats? Or is this another iteration of a pattern this war has repeated more than a dozen times? Between hours 12 and 36, Russia's defense ministry releases its formal military assessment of the Engels 2 strike. This document is being analyzed with extreme precision by intelligence agencies across NATO. The specific language used matters more than the substance. If the document characterizes the attack as an act of war against Russia, rather than an act of Ukrainian aggression enabled by Western weapons, the legal and political framing shifts in ways that matter for what Russia decides next. Between hours 36 and 72, one of two things happens. Either Russia launches its largest conventional retaliatory strike of the entire war, targeting Kiev's government district, military command headquarters, and potentially the political leadership of Ukraine directly. Or the pattern holds again. Russia issues the warning, creates maximum anxiety, and then continues the conventional war at the same grinding pace while waiting to see whether the warning causes NATO governments to hesitate on future weapons deliveries. Let's talk about what Russia can actually do, because vague references to escalation are less useful than specific analysis of real options. The first option is accelerated conventional strikes on Ukraine, but with targets that have previously been avoided. Russia has conducted devastating missile barrages throughout this war, but it has consistently shown restraint about one specific category of target: the top political leadership of Ukraine, the presidential compound in Kyiv, the Verkhovna Rada, Zelensky himself. Russia has had opportunities to attempt decapitation strikes and has not taken them. That restraint is a choice, not a capability limitation. It could end. A successful strike on Ukrainian political leadership would not necessarily end the war, but it would fundamentally change its character and create chaos in Ukrainian decision-making at the worst possible moment. The second option is action against NATO supply infrastructure. This is the scenario with the most catastrophic potential because it involves Article 5. Weapons moving from Poland, Germany, Romania, and the Baltic states to Ukraine travel through specific rail lines, specific border crossings, and specific logistics hubs. Russia's military intelligence services maintain detailed targeting packages for all of them. Putin's explicit statement about going beyond Ukraine's geographic boundaries was understood by NATO military planners as a direct reference to exactly this option. A deliberate Russian strike on a weapons storage facility on Polish soil would not be a gray zone incident. It would be an act of war against a NATO member requiring a collective response. The third option is what defense analysts call a nuclear demonstration. Russia detonates a low-yield nuclear device in an uninhabited area, the Black Sea being the most frequently discussed location in classified assessments, as a coercive signal. No one dies directly, but it would be the first use of a nuclear weapon in warfare since August 9, 1945, over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. The psychological impact on global markets, on NATO political cohesion, on every government on Earth, would be unlike anything that the current generation of political leaders has ever been required to manage. The fourth option is the one every NATO defense minister has wargamed and hopes never to face: tactical nuclear use against a Ukrainian military formation or a Ukrainian city. American officials have stated repeatedly, in public and in private diplomatic communications, that such an action would trigger a devastating conventional military response by the United States and its allies against Russian forces in Ukraine. Not a nuclear response. A conventional response of such scale and intensity that it would destroy Russia's military capacity in Ukraine entirely. Whether Putin genuinely believes that warning is the central intelligence question of this entire crisis. And the fifth option, which most analysts currently consider most probable, is what Russia is already doing. Issuing the most credible-sounding threat possible while continuing the conventional war, calculating that the fear of escalation will cause NATO governments to pause weapons decisions, generate internal political pressure on Ukraine toward negotiation, and allow Russia to consolidate its territorial gains. Psychological warfare at strategic scale. It has produced results before. The reaction across Europe to Putin's warning has not been uniform. The divisions are real, they are significant, and they reflect exactly the fault lines that Russian information operations, Russian-funded political movements, and Russian diplomatic pressure have been working to deepen for over a decade. Poland's response was immediate and unambiguous. Prime Minister Donald Tusk said on May 8th that Poland will not be intimidated by threats, nuclear or otherwise, and that Europe's collective response to Russian aggression must be one of resolve rather than hesitation. The three Baltic defense ministers issued a joint statement calling for preemptive reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank, and warning explicitly that any appearance of alliance hesitation will be interpreted by Moscow as an invitation to escalate further. These are not theoretical positions. Poland and the Baltic states share borders with Russia or with Russian allied Belarus. Their governments have contingency plans. Their populations have lived under the shadow of this threat in a way that governments in Paris, Berlin, and Rome have not. Germany's response was more complicated. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who has been more assertive on Ukraine policy than his predecessor Olaf Scholz, reaffirmed German commitment to Ukraine's defense and condemned Putin's language as irresponsible. But there was a 36-hour window between Putin's statement and Merz's public response, during which the German government made no public comment. That silence lasted long enough to be noticed. It was noticed in Warsaw. It was noticed in Tallinn. It was noticed in Kiev. France under Macron issued a statement of support for Ukraine while simultaneously, in language consistent with Macron's entire approach to this conflict, leaving open a diplomatic pathway. Macron has argued consistently throughout this war that Europe must not close the door on eventual negotiations with Moscow, and that finding off-ramps is as important as applying military pressure. The Eastern European members of NATO have never agreed with this position. They believe negotiation under current conditions rewards aggression and validates the principle that military force can redraw European borders. This disagreement has been present within NATO since February 2022. It has never been fully resolved, and it becomes most visible and most consequential exactly in moments like this one. Now let's zoom out and ask the fundamental question that this entire crisis forces onto the table. Why does this pattern keep repeating? Ukraine crosses a line, Russia issues a severe warning, the West experiences maximum anxiety. The catastrophe, Russia implied, does not arrive in the form described. And then the next crisis comes, with the same structure but higher stakes. The answer lies in the strategic logic of both sides, neither of which has changed its fundamental objectives despite 4 years of devastating war. Russia's objective has been stated consistently by Putin himself since at least 2021. He does not accept Ukraine as a genuinely sovereign state separate from Russia. He views NATO expansion toward Russia's borders as an existential threat that justifies military action to prevent. He wants a Ukraine that is neutral, demilitarized, and unable to make independent strategic choices that Moscow did not sanction. None of those objectives have been achieved. Ukraine is more integrated with Western institutions than it was before the invasion. It is more militarized, not less, and it has demonstrated, through 4 years of resistance that most Western analysts did not expect to last 4 weeks, that it can and will make independent strategic choices regardless of what Moscow wants. Ukraine's objective is equally clear: full restoration of internationally recognized borders, including Crimea, security guarantees sufficient to deter future Russian aggression, integration into European and potentially Atlantic security structures. None of those objectives have been achieved either. Russia holds more Ukrainian territory today than it did before the invasion. Ukraine's path to NATO membership remains blocked by alliance disagreements about the risks of admitting a country at war, and the security guarantees that Kyiv has received, while substantial in weapons terms, fall short of the formal treaty commitments it has sought. Neither side has achieved its objectives. Neither side is prepared to redefine its objectives in ways that would make a negotiated settlement possible. And so the war continues, and the crises come, and each one tests the pattern a little harder than the last. The nuclear shadow over this conflict is not new, but it has never been darker than it is in May 2026. Russia possesses approximately 5,900 nuclear warheads in total, of which approximately 1,500 are deployed on operational strategic delivery systems, including the intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers based at facilities including Engels 2. Russia also possesses an estimated 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, shorter-range devices designed for battlefield or regional use. These numbers are not in dispute. What is in dispute is the threshold at which Russian leadership would actually authorize their use. Western intelligence agencies have assessed this question continuously since February 2022. Their conclusions, to the extent that governments have made them public, are that Russia's nuclear threshold is higher than Putin's rhetoric implies, but lower than NATO's most optimistic assumptions. In other words, Russia will not use nuclear weapons simply because it is losing a conventional battle, but it might use them if it concluded that the regime itself was facing collapse, or that a NATO intervention was imminent and would succeed in destroying Russian military capacity entirely. Ukraine's May 7th strikes on Engels 2 do not meet either of those thresholds by any reasonable analysis. Russia is not losing in any catastrophic sense. The regime is not facing collapse. NATO has not intervened directly. But the strikes do raise a different and more subtle threshold question. At what point does the accumulation of Ukrainian strikes on Russian strategic infrastructure cause Moscow to conclude that restraint is being exploited rather than rewarded? That every time Russia absorbs a strike without a proportionate response, it invites the next, larger strike? Putin's May 7th warning can be read as the beginning of an answer to that question. Here is what every analyst who is honest about this war will tell you, and what European governments are telling themselves in classified sessions that they will not say publicly. The pattern that has held throughout this conflict, the pattern of Ukraine escalating, Russia threatening, the West experiencing maximum fear, and then the catastrophe not arriving, cannot hold forever. Deterrence theory does not guarantee that rational actors will behave rationally under all conditions at all levels of pressure. History provides no shortage of examples of wars that no one intended to start, that began through miscalculation, misread signals, domestic political pressures that overrode strategic logic, or simple accidents that cascaded beyond anyone's ability to control. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was not supposed to start a war that killed 20 million people. No one who made decisions in July of that year believed the outcome that arrived in August was possible. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 came within hours of nuclear exchange, not because either Kennedy or Khrushchev wanted nuclear war, but because the situation created pressures and timelines that nearly stripped both men of the space to choose differently